I took Sociology 102 and now I'm a communist, Dad. Like, you know.
All your worst fears have come true.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread, a podcast where two dudes engage in radical self-education. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
This week we're going back to Papa Lenin.
Yes, Lenin. We've read Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism.
Correct. And I have a feeling we're going to be coming back to Lenin quite a lot as we continue forward. I feel very tethered to Lenin and Engels specifically for whatever reason. Like I really want to come back and kind of read everything that they did.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
I think like reading a lot of the other stuff, like Trotsky was sometimes a bit of a slog to try to get through. Lenin writes with the fervor that even when he's talking about fucking railroads and banks and shit, I'm still pretty engaged in what he has to say, as engaged as one can be in that sort of data.
Yes. Here's a warning. If you're a fellow audiobook listener like me, this book is full of charts and graphs and tables, and the narrator that I listen to read every table row by row, column by column, point by point. It was great. Really good. So the statistics I definitely did not catch on the first pass. Had to, go back and read the tables and really see what the fuck he's talking about because it was bad. Bad on the audiobook.
So usually we introduce the writer, usually we introduce the work. I don't really think that that's necessary in either case here.
No. You know who Lenin is. This was written in exile. One interesting thing that is made clear in the introduction is that it was written under censorship. Lenin wrote it with the purpose of being published openly in the public. So it is censored. However, that's a self-admission because I still think that it's quite revolutionary in its tone, even if it's not like calling for full revolution. But it does absolutely call for a fight against capitalism.
Yeah.
One thing that I really like here is that he quotes bourgeois sources. I think that is something that really helps make his point because he's saying like these things are so obvious that even the people studying it on the bourgeois side of things can't help but talk about these exact forms of exploitation that he's writing about in this work.
Yeah, you don't have to be a radical or a revolutionary to recognize the trends that he's pointing out.
Yeah. In fact, he comes back to dunk on good old Karl Kautsky, that fucking revisionist scum.
I was going to say yet another work in Lenin's entire library that's just mostly shitting on Kautsky.
Fuck Karl Kautsky. What's interesting, though, is that there's a lot of times where he will talk about what Kautsky's saying, and then as a critique of Kautsky, he's like, even these like bourgeois economists or like center-left historians have a more progressive view of imperialism than Kautsky does. And it's because Kautsky is doing apologia, like he's doing fucking imperialist wishery or something.
Yeah. Those
things, I think, really lend a lot of strength to this book. Not necessarily that he's shitting on Karl Kautsky, but at this point, I'm a devoted Kautsky hater. So...
Yeah, it feels a little unfair to so strongly dislike Kautsky, even though I've never read any of Kautsky's work.
Fuck whatever he wrote. I've read enough through Lenin to know that he's a dirty revisionist, an opportunist, an adventurist, a tailist. No, I'm just trying to come up with all the different ists I can think of right now.
To a degree, I still feel some drive to read like Proudhon, even though the Paris Commune very clearly shits on him and everything that he had to contribute to that.
I also have been a little bit more on an anarchist bent because I started on audiobook The Ego in His Own by Max Stirner.
Okay.
And he talks a lot about individualism, but he's like one of the, I hate to say like one of the big thinkers of anarchism again, but about individualist anarchism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I am so curious to see like what Proudhon has to say. I just don't know if we need to contextualize it around the things we've already read. Like his theoretical pieces might be worth looking at.
Yeah.
But
like Property is Theft, I think, is the most famous essay that he wrote.
Yeah, I'm still definitely down to check out that stuff.
Yeah, same.
He did write this in exile, Lenin. Did I say that already?
Yep.
He's in Switzerland, dude, before the Germans shuttled him across as a spy for the Kaiser. Okay, the whole Bolshevik revolution is a big ploy by the Kaiser of Germany who brought Lenin from Switzerland to Russia. People say that, but it's not true.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm all over the place here.
I mean, how do you want to start? I don't really know how to jump into it.
Yeah, I was thinking about it earlier. I mean, I think it's probably best to just talk about the thread that's going throughout this book, and then we can delve into the different pieces here. So what Lenin is saying in this book, I think, is something that most people already agree with. For maybe in 1905, it wasn't such a, it was more of a stunning revelation.
Mm-hmm.
But what Lenin is saying here is really simple. He's saying that the tendency of capitalism is to concentrate its power into monopoly, right? That has affected all sorts of different industries throughout capitalism, including finance.
Mm-hmm.
And those banks monopolizing themselves have formed cartels and syndicates as a way of pushing out free competition. And as a result of that, cartelization, syndicalization, the world essentially is divided up. It's a division of the world among essentially the finance capital hegemony. And so what Lenin is arguing here is in two fronts. One, that capital will always concentrate towards monopoly, and that's obviously a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And two, that concentration is what is leading to outward aggressive expansion for, new markets, new exploitation, new colonialisms, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's important that it be recognized as twofold. It's one, expansion for new markets, and two, expansions for new exploitation. I like that you broke it up in that way, because I think that Lenin makes it very clear that that's part of where the colonialist attitude of imperialism comes from, the need to expand into new markets, because at a certain point, you've exhausted every resource that you have in a given space, and you've exhausted the possibility of selling to all of the people that are left there. And then also, beyond that, it's about finding new people and natural resources to exploit in order to find more products to then continue the cycle.
Yes.
Because capitalism demands an infinite expansion.
Right.
And you can't do that in a space that has finite resources. And so on the one level, it's really just about expansion for the sake of finding more resources, whether that be natural resources or human I was going to say human resources, but what I mean by that is exploitation of workers.
Yeah, there's really something there, because Lenin stresses that it's not merely like a raw material thing. There is an entirely other aspect to it. And, this is what part of where he's setting up, talking about like the labor aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that was really interesting to me, because he's saying that the way that this concentration of capitalism has worked out, right, it elevates a portion of the working class to a new strata, essentially, in order to divide the working class up so they're more conquerable. And the first half of this book is very statistics heavy, and it wasn't that I was feeling shaky, but I was kind of like, okay, we get the point here. But once he starts to make the connections between that concentration and like the global politic, the foreign policy, kind of the status of the world as it is, I think that that's really what gives this book its major credence, is that Lenin is really talking with very clear eyes about what's happening in the world around him, the way that these essentially like global hegemonies are expanding, and not only that, but how they're essentially collaborating together to divide up the world in their favor so they can make more profit.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because my initial response when I started reading this was like, I don't need to be convinced that capitalism is terrible. It feels a little bit like that's what's happening here. And I get it's hard not to read this sort of stuff anachronistically. Mm-hmm. It's 120 years old. It's very difficult not to look back on it and be like, yeah, that's foregone. We're ready to move on. But I do agree that that stuff is relevant. And then as he starts getting into the effect of that kind of attitude, that's where I found it most interesting. And we can just jump right into some quotes.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. Aaron here. Quick editor's note. Will and I are reading from the Essential Works of Lenin, the Dover edition. So when we start throwing out page numbers, there you go. On page 251, another special feature of imperialism, which is connected with the facts we were describing, is the decline in emigration from imperialist countries and the increase in immigration to those countries from the backward countries where low wages are paid. Mm-hmm. And so like one of the kind of after effects of this colonial expansion, this imperialist expansion, is to deplete resources and make the situation so uninhabitable in those spaces that then people that are native to or living in those places will then immigrate to the kind of imperial center because it supposedly has all this extra opportunity. And he says even there at the bottom of that page, to your point, he's talking about in the United States, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe are engaged in the mostly poorly paid occupations, while American workers provide the highest percentage of overseers or of the better paid workers. Mm-hmm. And so this is part of what that strata that you were talking about, how that we then create another class of workers that are the overseers of the most exploited folks that are being forced to immigrate into the country because of the colonial expansion.
I had that thought this last couple of weeks recently that the middle class is like not only the buffer, they're also the protectors. They are the overseers because they're like that in-between part that is essentially, they're so close to being the working class that they're more desperate to get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like you're just taking people one step away from the kind of suffering that they're used to and saying like, this is as good as you can get. What really made me think about it was on the fucking Columbia campus, how like the frat boys were doing frat boy Freikorp type shit where they were storming and they were hoisting flags and like beating people up and dancing and being racist and just being real fuckheads. And it's like, these are people that have been, you know, essentially lifted via privilege and they're now punching down essentially. The same thing I think is kind of what's going on here. In fact, I had that same section highlighted.
Yeah, the middle class operates as sort of like a bulwark to the upper class in the sense that they will adamantly protect the upper class because they're, like you said, so close.
Yeah.
People in the middle class are so close to becoming working class, being forced down that kind of social strata that they will fight fucking tooth and nail because they know how fucking terrible it is.
Yeah.
They can see it. They have access to it. And so they're like the most loyal protectors.
I think on the flip side, too, it's like they also see themselves as being close to the upper class, even if they're the furthest.
It's a fucking delusion,
you know? I mean, that's the classic thing is that like every American thinks they're a millionaire in the making. Temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? Yeah. My good friend comes from a working class family and his dad was always like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And he told me once that he was like, why haven't you done that, Dad? Like, why are we so fucking broke then?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that kind of contradiction that I think is inherent to what we're talking about.
This quote about immigration really got me thinking a lot about like the southern border of the United States. Yeah. And again, how adamantly the middle class is like weaponized to, quote, protect the southern border from any immigration, even though the conditions that bring people to immigrate are created by the same attitudes that continue this kind of imperialist expansion everywhere. It's just bonkers to me.
Even as we saw with Jakarta Method, right, it's not that they even want to send their people here, right? It's just that, like, this is the option. You know, it's this or the hellscape that we created for you there. You know, and I know that that's, like, thumbing your nose a bit at the global south, but, I mean, it's true that we have a higher standard of living here. You know, it's not for nothing. I mean, it's because we've spent the last 200 years being the dominant imperialist power on this fucking planet.
Yeah, I mean, annexing places like Puerto Rico, everything that we did in fucking Guatemala, Grenada, Panama, all the shit that we have done created conditions that it's like, I'm not saying it's impossible to have a good life there or anything like that,
right?
But like, there is an option to come here, to immigrate here, because it's like, well, you can live under the thumb there in shitty conditions, or you can live under the thumb here in slightly elevated conditions.
And there's something else I was thinking about when we're talking about people immigrating from those countries to, I guess, just to give it a better term. I mean, Lenin talks here about the division of the world between creditors and debtors, right? It's like colonizers and colonists. So, you know, for those countries sending their people to these like colonial empires, what I was thinking about, though, what that made me think about is the way that colonization had changed in the public eye. On page 232, Lenin talks about comparing the current imperialism to historical empires, right? And he says, but general arguments about imperialism which ignore or put into the background the fundamental difference of social economic systems inevitably degenerate into absolutely empty banalities, or into grandiloquent comparisons like Greater Rome and Greater Britain. Even the colonial policy of capitalism in its previous stage is essentially different from colonial policy of finance capital. And it made me think of the idea of like a colony as a settlement, you know, like there's settler colonialism, there's extractive colonialism, there's even like the idea of a civilizing mission, you know, like we're setting up this beacon of civilization in this uncharted wilderness so that we can tame these savage people, you know. And it just made me think about the evolution of colonialism as we're going through. Lenin is specifically talking about a kind of colonialism here that is not only focused on the resources, like we had said earlier, but also on that immigration power, right? The transfer of those resources as well. I don't know. Just this is a new stage of capitalism, right? That's something that Lenin is talking about very specifically. And in fact, it's one of his critiques of Kautsky, because under Kotsky's definition, he puts imperialism forward as like a policy, like it's a choice, like it's a law that they've voted, a bill that they've voted into law. But in reality, what Lenin is saying is that imperialism is so tied to capitalism that as capitalism is evolving into this new concentrated stage, that imperialism is also evolving into a new kind of imperialism.
Yeah. I would agree with all that. On that same page, he says, the more capitalism develops, the more the need for raw materials arises, the more bitter competition becomes, and the more feverishly the hunt for raw materials proceeds all over the world, the more desperate becomes the struggle for the acquisition of colonies. So, like, capitalism fuels this form of imperialism in large part because that need for expansion creates this, like, feverish pitch to race to colonize as much as you can so you have as much quote ownership over the stakes of raw materials and the workers there that can be exploited.
Yeah, on top of that too, I'll have to find the quote, but he talks about colonization as like a release valve, like an outlet for the revolutionary potential that they're seeing in their countries at the time. It's like they think of those colonies as a tool to make the lives of their working class better by essentially creating a new underclass.
Like you're no longer the poor because now that we found this group that's poorer than you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same kind of thing as that unequal exchange that happens these days. You could hire like a Pakistani PhD to be your math tutor. And it's like a math tutor in America that has a PhD would be paid very highly, but you can go on Chegg and get it for $15 an hour because the guy lives in Pakistan. Yeah. It's not that the math is any different. It's just that their society is under our thumb, essentially. It's been deflated to the point that kind of transaction is possible. And that only happens on a basis where there's two classes of country, essentially, right? The debtor and the creditor.
Yeah.
I did find the quote. Okay, so this isn't exactly the quote I was thinking of, but I do like it here on 229, second paragraph. Even at the time, these leading British bourgeois politicians fully appreciated the connection between what might be called their purely economic and political social roots of modern imperialism. Chamberlain advocated imperialism by calling it a true, wise, and economical policy. So it's easy to talk about imperialism like it's a dirty word, but these bourgeois politicians and economists are well aware of the value that it has. Right? Salvation lies in monopolies, said the capitalists, as they formed cartels, syndicates, and trusts. Salvation lies in monopolies, echoed the political leaders of the bourgeois, hastening to appropriate the parts of the world not yet shared out. Here we go. This is it. In the block quote below from Cecil Rhodes in 1895, it says, my cherished idea is a solution for the social problem, i.e., in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands for settling the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I've always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists. And like,
said the quiet part out loud.
I know, it's like such a mask-off moment. And like, that's what Lenin is really saying here. He's like, I don't even need to quote communists for this point to be got across. You can look at the numbers and see it happening actively. You can look at the historical data and see it happening actively. And I know earlier we were talking about kind of an anachronistic view of what's happening in this book in maybe today's lens, but I really don't think it's that far off. I mean, just to give a few examples, really early on in the book, this is the one statistic I actually highlighted on page 184. He's comparing the percentage of trusts, okay, in 1904 and 1909. So all enterprises are divided into three categories according to whether or not they belong to individuals, to private firms, or to corporations. The latter, meaning corporations, in 1904 comprised 23.6%. And in 1909, 25.9%, i.e., more than 1/4 of the total industrial enterprises in the country. So that's already one thing, is that corporations make up 1/4 of the industry in the country, which is a fucking crazy number.
Yeah.
Okay, that's definitely a tendency towards monopoly in my mind. But here's what really got me about the statistic. These employ in 1904 70.6%, and in 1909 75.6% of total wage earners.
Yeah.
1/4 of the industry is employing 3/4 of the wage earners. Like, it's so clear. It's so obvious. Economics people, economists, Jesus. Economists have a set of assumptions that they make in order for their science to be true, okay? And they're not true. Like, the possibility of all those assumptions being real is like 0.1%. It's complete fucking cockamamie bullshit. And, look at the numbers, look at the history. And I was even thinking, like we've put laws into place to prevent monopoly, right? Everybody can name...
Nudge, wink, wink.
Yeah, everyone can name one, the Sherman Antitrust Act,
Yep.
but it was not like, it did some things, yes, but it was really not that much. Have we passed any other anti-monopoly laws in the same way? We do prevent some mergers from happening in today's age, but I still think that these same trends that Lenin is talking about 100 plus years ago are still totally relevant today.
Oh, big time.
Yeah. One other example is the idea of these syndicates creating subsidiary companies in order to make their data sheets more indecipherable. I love that he says it that way. It's like, it made me think about the fact that if you go into a Kroger, every good on the shelf is owned by one of three companies: Unilever, Johnson & Johnson, or Procter & Gamble.
Yep.
Basically, and it's like, people have been saying this for 100 years now. What the fuck is going on?
Yeah.
Is it because we think it's better? I don't know.
If you take a longer view of that, right? Like, I think to the layperson, you see like corporate mergers and that kind of conglomeration of industry as something that in the short term can create efficiencies that lower prices, right? And so to the layperson, they think, okay, well, Procter & Gamble buying this company now makes it part of its larger infrastructure, so that company has less overhead. They can use their existing infrastructure to get the stuff out faster, produce it more efficiently, blah, 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 and that'll lower prices to the consumer. But that, even if that is true, which I would argue rarely is it, but even if that is true, that's a very kind of myopic view, because what you see in the long term is eventually, once Procter & Gamble becomes the one that owns all, you know what I mean? They have this like supposed competition of capitalism no longer has any way of affecting the prices that they put on shit. So, that's a short-term kind of thinking, but I think that that's what leads us to being okay with it, or like recognizing it, seeing it plainly in its face for what it is, and just going along with it.
It's just a crazy disconnect in the mind to uphold the idea that, and this is like a pretty conservative view, but to uphold the idea that like the market regulates life properly, but then also we have all these things that undermine the market essentially,
Well, and also all of the regulations that prove that the market won't regulate itself, so we choose to put those regulations in place.
Of course. Even on the next page, this is on 186, I love in the middle, he's talking about the German economist Kestner, who wrote a book, especially on the subject, The Struggle Between Cartels and Outsiders. He entitled Compulsory Organization. Although, in order to present capitalism in the true light, he should have given it the title Compulsory Submission to Monopolist Combines.
Yeah.
One thing that's really interesting that Lenin talks about here is the fact that monopoly still exists alongside free competition. It's not a competitor in the sense that it's stamped out free competition. But I think that what Lenin is saying is that the cartels still uphold this ideal of competition as a way of maybe like a public-facing thing. Like competition still exists, but it's not the same kind of capitalism that we're dealing anymore ultimately, because the majority of the power is now held by the syndicates. On that same page, Lenin lists a ton of different methods that all these different companies use.
Oh, yeah.
Stopping supplies of raw materials, stopping supplies of labor, cutting off deliveries, all sorts of shit. Like the power amassed by a monopoly is not only hard to overstate, but it's also antithetical to the market ideals of capitalism. It's not a freedom of information, right? It's not even necessarily like a voluntary agreement for trade. If you're under the coercion of the stoppage of raw materials or systematic lowering of prices, like imagine doing your very best as a small business and then having Walmart come in and undercut you, which is what Walmart does in every small town across America.
Yeah, that was Amazon's business plan also. Yeah. The way they took over every market was by beating them on price, taking a loss as long as it took for the other companies to go out of business or be bought by Amazon. And then they raised prices back up.
Yeah. One other thing that I'm just like, Lenin. One thing Lenin says is that it's no longer about the production and distribution of goods. It's now about the distribution of finance or capital. Like what's actually the commodity here is that power of the finance capital. The bourgeois economist's block quote here says, "The greatest success no longer goes to the merchant whose technical and commercial experience enables him best of all to estimate the needs of the buyer and, so to say, discover latent demand," right? Like that's like the traditional capitalist fantasy. Instead, It goes to the speculative genius, parentheses with a question mark and an exclamation point.
Yeah.
That always cracks me up. Lenin's like, look here, look at this. He's saying it.
He can't even fucking let that block quote go without interjecting.
It's two sentences. Like, yeah, and totally fine. But, you know, even a little further down, the big profits go to the genius of financial manipulation.
Yeah.
You know, and that's so true even today. Like, think about every technological innovation, like a big innovative startup in the last couple of years. None of them have made anything. They have only exploited labor laws, right? Airbnb doesn't create anything. It just exploits the labor laws around hotels about short-term rentals. The same thing with Uber. You know, it's undercutting the taxi industry via another labor exploitation.
Yeah.
Right? That's even how Amazon does it. Their delivery drivers are essentially fucking contractors who are timed to the fucking moment.
That's why they're pissing in bottles. I wrote the words shock doctrine right next to that. It brought to mind, I just yesterday read an article about big oil conspiring to raise the prices of gasoline post-pandemic shutdown to try to get their quarterly profits back up to a reasonable level because everything actually went lower when no one was going anywhere.
Yeah.
And so, like, to pretend that there isn't this sort of intentional manipulation is ridiculous. And also, to the point about the quote that you pointed out here, I think about this in the context of like an artisan or a craftsperson. Like, I like to make furniture.
Yeah.
Okay? It's like a fun thing that I like to do. And in theory, if you believe the theory of capitalism, the way you become a successful furniture maker is by making the best furniture. And that's not the furniture that sells. That's not the furniture that is... I mean, people can hardly make a living as furniture makers nowadays. And those that can manage to eke it out have a tendency to do it by making like high-spec custom pieces that are going to just, you know, the top 1% of buyers in the world.
Yeah, you're aiming for the whales.
Yeah.
You know?
Because it's the only way that you can manage. Or you totally... I happen to know a person who runs... I think he's like a shop manager for a furniture making company. And it's just all CNC run. And so you just need a person to operate the CNC. And that's the only way you can batch out furniture at the speed at which and the you need to in order to turn a profit on it, because the raw materials cost a certain amount. And if you can exercise the actual craftsperson from the situation, you don't have to be a furniture maker. You just need to know, you need to be taught this one process that you do because you pull it off the CNC machine. And then that's what actually makes the leg of a chair instead of being a craftsperson. And so, I don't know, I was just thinking a lot about that because it's a shame.
I mean, you know, I think that's a great example. It's like, truly, it's not about being the best craftsman, or even if you want to be like, if you want to differentiate it, like there is hardly a market for that kind of person anymore. You know, like if you're making low-end furniture, you're undercut by a big corporation. If you're making high-end furniture, then it's a hard thing to find, right? You're in a, maybe not a saturated market, but like one that's not easy. You have to do a lot of extra legwork. Yeah. I think that's a solid example for sure.
Speaking of statistics, there were a few that I was a little mouth agape at when we were reading on pages 227 and 228. So he's talking about, like, this comes from chapter 6, the division of the world among the great powers. And he takes a 24-year period between 1876 and 1900 and is looking at how much land has been colonized by capitalist imperialist countries. Number one, the bit that really just blew me away, it's not outside of what I know to be true, but also just seeing the number, I was like, holy shit, like that's wild.
Yeah.
We get this table, percentage of territories belonging to the European colonial powers, including the United States. In 1876, 10.8% of Africa was, quote, owned by the colonial powers. 24 years later, 90.4%. That's fucking crazy. In less than 3 decades, 80% of a continent, the largest continent on the planet.
Yeah. Full of people, too. Not just empty.
This is an empty land.
Yeah.
Fucking bonkers.
Yeah. You know, I remember learning about, like, the scramble for Africa, but, like, that was not an exaggeration. You know, like, there's a reason they include that, because it's such a significant... I mean, they include that in school history, I should say. And it's because it's such a significant redivision of the world. In fact, just further down that page, I highlighted this quote here, but the characteristic feature of this period is that it's the final partition of the globe. Like, what land is left to be conquered? Not in the sense that a new partition is impossible. On the contrary, new partitions are possible and inevitable, but in the sense that colonial policy has completed the seizure of unoccupied territories on our planet. A little bit further, he says, only redivision is possible.
Yep.
I don't know. There's something about that just kills hope. Like only redivision, like all the players are set. It's just about how how the board is set at this point.
Yeah.
That really sucks. I don't even think it's impossible to square that kind of prediction with the future history, meaning like decolonization and whatnot, because we are certainly going to have to dive into decolonization or colonial theory a lot. But even those new players, so to speak, those new countries are still thrust into the same paradigm of like debtor and creditor.
Mm-hmm.
Neocolonialism isn't for nothing. It's just that we've changed our methods from boots and guns to loans and banks.
That's a good way to put it.
Part of this made me think about our U.S. critique of China, in the Belt and Roads program, where they're saying like there's a Chinese debt trap happening, like the CPC is going to Kenya and giving them a hospital, and it's so they can trap them in debt. And it's like, you motherfuckers have invented the World Bank, the IMF, and the whole nine. Don't try to tell me about that thing because China's doing it now. If I have to throw my hat in with one of the two, I'm going to pick the other guy here.
Yeah. This is just like the TikTok conversation from the last episode.
Yeah.
One of the few underlying motives is really like, you can't do that because we want to do that.
Yeah.
It's not that TikTok can't exist. It's that you have to sell it to a US-backed company.
Yes.
Just fucking bonkers.
Right. And it's happening, by the way.
It's just the redivision.
It is. That's I didn't even think about it that way, but it's like literally, the territory is already there. It's just being redivided now, instead of being a Chinese owner, it's an American owner. Like, that's actually a really interesting parallel that I hadn't thought about.
Another bit of statistics that just kind of stood out to me is on the next page, on page 228.
Yeah.
Still talking about this period. Now he's actually moved it up a little bit, 1884 to 1900. Where he says this is a period of intensification of the colonial expansion of the European states. And according to the estimates from some bourgeois economists, Great Britain during these years acquired 3.7 million square miles of territory with a population of 57 million inhabitants. Again, it's not empty land.
Yeah.
These are fucking people's lives. France acquired 3.6 million square miles with a population of 36.5 million inhabitants. Germany, 1 million square miles with a population of 16.7 million inhabitants. Belgium, 900,000 square miles with 30 million inhabitants. Portugal, 800,000 square miles with 9 million inhabitants. That's a lot of fucking people.
Yeah.
I had the similar experience to reading the Jakarta Method, where, again, it's not new information. Reading the Jakarta Method, it wasn't new to me to know that the United States and the CIA are going out and meddling and doing shitty stuff, propping up like crony capitalist leaders out everywhere. But the sheer numbers of it, I guess there was a part of the scope of it was lost to me until I looked at the numbers and was like, holy fucking shit.
Yeah.
This is hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like seeing have you ever looked at like the true size comparison of countries on a map,
Yeah.
It feels that way, where it's like this new context it's the same numbers, the same shape, but the new context is really making it clear what the fuck happened.
Yeah.
And like, this obviously goes without being said, but it was violent conquest. Like, it's not a peaceable process.
Yeah.
People were oppressed, people were murdered, people were beaten. You, the listener, don't need us to tell you how fucked up colonies are. Like,
yeah. I just, the numbers, I don't know. I had to like stop and take a breath reading this page. I have a tendency to lean toward fatalism all of the time.
Yeah.
And my natural cynicism shines through in everything that I do. But reading these pages and getting those statistics, I was just like, holy shit.
It's really something. I was just thinking about a little bit later where he's talking about export trade. I mean, just to double back kind of on that point of financial manipulation being the name of the game here, Lenin really describes a lot of petty tricks that these, I guess, hegemons use. One that I thought was really interesting was on page 259, where he's talking about the process of that. I'm trying to think of how to phrase it, but he's trying to create the connection between the debtor country and the creditor country. I don't know why I said debtor like that. Fucking weird. He's trying to create the connection between the two, okay? The bourgeois argument is that trade going to countries that are dependent on... This is hard to phrase. I'm just kind of thinking of that double that double dipping, he says on 260, the next page, the increase in exports is closely connected with the swindling tricks of finance capital. It's not concerned with bourgeois morality, but with skinning the ox twice. First, it pockets the profit from the loan. Then it pockets other profits from the same loan, which the borrower uses to make purchases from Krupp or to purchase railway materials. So, a little bit unrelated, but I was just thinking of like, it's almost like a vicious cycle where the colony is so, I mean, indebted is kind of a silly word to use here, but they're totally reliant on the country above it. And I don't know where I was going with this.
It sounds a little bit to me, I mean, it got me thinking about something else that he said in here. This idea of this like double dipping or whatever got me thinking a lot about war as capitalist conquest.
Yeah.
And the idea that U.S. weapons makers make weapons that get used on foreign soil to cause death, destruction, havoc, chaos, dismay. And then U.S. companies get called in to get the contracts to rebuild all of the stuff that the U.S. companies destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like capitalism, because of its need for infinite expansion, because of its tendency toward imperialist colonization, will always push outward. And just like you use that quote here on 260, will skin the ox twice.
Skin the ox twice. Yeah, earlier on he says to skim the cream twice, too. A lot of good ones there. Actually made me think of something there. One, the way that we're not in a war right now, but our weapons manufacturers are still making big bank because we use modern wars as testing grounds for our own weapons. That's kind of the whole thing in Ukraine that's going on. We're just sending our shit there to be fucking field tested, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any interest in helping them out. And likewise, we're in the same kind of technological exchange with Israel, where they teach our cops how to brutalize our own civilians better.
Yeah.
And in addition, we give them... I mean, it's not that we're just giving them money, though. It's that... And we are giving them plenty of aid, but they're also like supporting us. We're supporting them. It's a back and forth relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I know Israel is a particularly complex one, of course, but I was thinking specifically of Ukraine, where it's like our weapons are going there. I mean, even Eisenhower, that was like his big thing at the end of his presidency. He was like, you got to beware the military-industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
The saving grace of America's economic downfall was the fact that we were juiced by wartime production, and that was it. And a big part of the following post-war years and then rebellion and then counter reaction by like Reaganite America comes from the fact that those juicy manufacturing profits, wartime industrial profits, were starting to go away.
Mm-hmm.
The government had to reckon with the fact that the boom was over, and then radical movements kind of sprung a parallel to those, and then we got the 80s out of that. It's like, how can we crush this down so it never happens again? And we've been in that fucking 80s cycle ever since.
Man, the radical potential of the United States in the late 60s we were right fucking there, man. We were right there.
Yeah.
To the point about, what did he say, skinning the ox twice and war as a means of capital investment almost.
Yeah.
On 239, he's shitting on Kautsky like usual. But he says imperialism is a striving for annexations. This is what the political part of Kautsky's definition amounts to. It is correct, but very incomplete. For politically, imperialism is in general a striving towards violence and reaction. And that stuck with me for a moment. And I kind of just sat and thought about what I thought that meant. And I finished reading this last night while I'm editing the last episode. And so I have kind of the conversation we had around the Jakarta method on my mind while I'm reading this and thinking about it. And one of the things that we said in the last episode was the realities of the death toll of capitalism versus communism, because it's one of the things that gets bandied about as anti-communist sentiment.
Right, like, communists killed 6 Gorillion people or whatever,
Whatever the fucking black book said, whatever, all that dumb shit.
Right.
But if you look at the actual numbers, you see the like actual violent force of capitalism way outweighing anything that happened under even the most bastardized versions of communism happening in the global world. And so I was just thinking, like, I wrote a little note to myself at the bottom of the page. I wrote, communism leads to ... capitalism leads to ... And I was just trying to think about it in this context, because this striving towards violence and reaction felt very much like that's an imperialist tendency that comes from capitalism being stretched to its final stage, right? And so capitalism leads to competition, communism leads to cooperation, capitalism leads to supremacy, communism leads to equality. And it's like, the violence that comes from communism comes from defending communism against the outside.
Right.
capitalism, the violence comes from.
Yeah, I was having this exact thought just now because I was like, it's ultimately about the resolution of the contradiction. On the communist side of things, that violence is a tool to resolve the conflict in favor of the oppressed, whereas in capitalism, the violence is a tool to resolve the conflict in favor of the oppressor.
Well said.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think something that's really interesting is a big critique that Lenin has of Kautsky here is that Kautsky says it's possible for a peaceful imperialism to happen, you know? And what Lenin is saying is like that peace is still full of war, still full of violence.
Yeah.
Let me actually find that bit because I really love what he says in that part. It's on page 263.
Okay.
What he's saying is that wise Kautsky separates one link. Yeah, sorry. Here we go. Yeah, this is what I got.
I love also that he calls him Marxist Kautsky and puts the Marxists in quotes. What a fucking
he's
shit poster,
dude,
man.
like the vitriol that they have for each other is so funny. Like it's the internet before the internet, man. Like, yeah. So okay, here's where I'll start. Peaceful alliance prepare the ground for wars, and in their turn grow out of wars. The one is the condition for the other, giving rise to alternating forms of peaceful and non-peaceful struggle out of a single basis of imperialist connection. So, like, regardless of whether it's peaceful or not, the basis is the same. It's the same expansion of exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
In order to pacify the workers and reconcile them with social chauvinists who have deserted to the side of the bourgeois, wise Kautsky separates one link of a single chain from the other. Okay, skip that a little bit. But I love here, instead of showing the vital connection between periods of imperialist peace and periods of imperialist war, Kautsky puts before the workers a lifeless abstraction solely in order to reconcile them to their lifeless leaders. Okay, so the point that he's making here is that the period in European history is broken into a bunch of different parts. The revolutionary period, the constitutional movement, the present period of commercial imperialism. I'm fucking all over the place. Here we go. I said that a bunch. But another writer divides the history of Great Britain's foreign policy since 1870 into four periods. The first Asiatic period, that of struggle against Russia. The African period, which is a struggle against France for the partition of Africa. This almost brought England and France to a war. The second Asiatic period, which was Japan against Russia. And the European period, chiefly anti-German. The political skirmishes of outposts take place on the financial field. That's really the key here. It's like even in the peace, there is still war happening. But I just really love that he says on the next one, behold the living reality of peaceful ultra-imperialist alliance. It's not peace, right? It's simply setting the stage for more war. And I think that it's maybe a little too deterministic to think of history in that sense sometimes, where it's like, a lot of people talk about World War II being inevitable, right? Not necessarily because Hitler was inevitable, but just that the constraints of the alliance of the time, the political environment or whatever, the tensions were there for a global war to start regardless. And Hitler was like the key in the engine, essentially.
The fuel on the fire.
Yeah. And part of me is like, you can't view history as such a chain of events, like one is directly informing the next because there were so many events that could have happened and didn't. But part of me also can't help but agree with Lenin here when he's saying that these in-between periods are just the build-up for another period of war. There's a big joke in this day about nothing ever happening. Like there's never any serious event that's happening. But I think it's really tough to look at the world around you and say that we're not leading to something. Chris has been really on edge recently, just about everything going on, and I can't falter.
Yeah, I don't know how you could look at what's happening in the United States right now and not, to some degree, fear the further decline into the militaristic fascist state.
Yeah.
Like we see it just being plainly put out there. It's very clearly we're watching a slow decline deeper into the state of fascism and just willingly letting it happen. I don't know how you could watch that and not see that there is an inevitable conflict that's going to arise.
Right.
Something is going to come from that because it's a powder keg.
Yeah. It's it's weird though because it's a feeling that I've had for many numerous events over the last couple of years. The question is always what's the off ramp, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's the off ramp for the Ukraine war? How does that end? What's the off ramp for what's happening in Israel right now? How does that end? There's so many things in the world where it's really difficult to see a resolution without additional conflict. I even think the election upcoming is like that. You cannot say this is a vote against authoritarianism if we currently have fucking jackbooted thugs out here smashing people's heads. You know, if we have the fraternal Freikorps out here fucking bolstering police forces just out of Greek fraternity pride, like absolute ridiculousness.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would argue that I think you said, where is the off-ramp? It's hard to see that. The point is that there shouldn't be one. If you can keep it in a state of perpetua, then you continue to...
The purpose is for there to be no off-ramp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The off-ramp comes from resistance to that. The off-ramp comes from any revolution against.
Yeah, that just made me think of the 68 protests, because, like, the anti-war movement certainly had an impact on Vietnam.
Oh, big time.
You know, and you can definitely see the same inklings of things happening in today, but it's a different flavor. You know?
I mean, well, you've got fucking face detection, you know, we're living in a deeper surveillance state than protesters were then.
Yeah.
So there's I don't know that I would say less incentive, but there's more incentive not to participate in things like that. And it's just fucking way easier for the fascist state to come down on those individuals.
Yeah.
And so it is a different kind of animal.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean,
not to be super fucking fatalistic and cynical again, but
I just don't, it's tough. I don't know. It's really shit. I hate it.
Even so FD Signifier put out a video earlier this week. Do you ever watch FD Signifier?
I haven't in a while, but I do know who he is.
So he put out a video earlier this week, just kind of in response to what's happening on college campuses and the police response to that. And in this was talking about how he has backed off as a quote unquote public figure, even backed off on some of the more radical political content that he was participating in. Like, he lives in Atlanta. And so he had a video about Cop City. He was talking quite a lot about that. And all of the things that are happening around that, like the fucking RICO charges being brought on people. So, you know, fucking passing out a flyer makes you complicit in conspiracy.
Yeah.
And all this sort of nonsense has motivated him to like step back. And because if you can get fucking called up for passing out flyers, what's the difference between having a very public YouTube video where you're rallying against the same sort of thing? I don't know where I was going with that exactly. It's just, the resistance against resistance is so strong.
Yeah, the suppression is rampant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I totally agree with you there. I hadn't even thought about it, but like, I mean, we're undergoing the same shit essentially, not on the podcast, but you know, Carissa's like, maybe we should own a gun. Like, that's not anything I've ever considered before. I mean, when I was younger, sure, but now I'm like, I'm never why would I need that?
Yeah.
But I don't know, it's just terrifying. Like, I don't think there's any debate whether it's like a new Red Scare or a Red Scare ongoing, but when is the switch going to get flipped, you know? I obviously hope that communists are never repressed wholeheartedly, more than they already are, by the way, but it's more of a silent oppression.
Shadow ban.
Yeah, exactly, right? And the thing is, like, what we're seeing is maybe a switch. No, I don't know if this is what we're seeing, but it feels a little bit like a switch from that kind of shadow ban practice to a more open suppression.
Yeah, well, because what fucking happens when they do it? Nothing.
Yeah.
Like, we're watching fucking... like you said, jackbooted thugs coming in, stamping on kids' heads.
Yeah.
Shooting them in the face with rubber bullets. I saw a kid that got shot in the face with a rubber bullet.
Absolutely.
And the public outcry is silence / thin blue line support for the fucking cops.
It's because...
Look what they did to this beautiful campus kind of bullshit.
This is the first fucking time that I've really felt like fucking fake news, mainstream media bullshit, like... You know, I feel like a fucking Trumper because I'm watching Jake Tapper be like, the protesters doing all this damage on campus. And I'm like, these are the police coming in. And you see, like, I saw someone post a schedule of, maybe it was the Columbia protest, where it was like, dialogue with a Palestinian, movie screening, arts and crafts, you know, and it's like from 8 to 8, they're having a little hangout, you know, and like, yeah, I'm for that kind of protest in the designated protest zone as well, mind you. But to see like the most benign protests, the protests are not anything. They're the perfect protests, right? They are like the ideal. It's people gathering peacefully to do peaceful things in, for the most part, places that they are allowed to be, are supposed to be. And our response is to send in the fucking goose steppers. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, and then to have the main media turn around and say, like, the protesters are in the wrong. You should think that. You should feel that. Like, I had a fucking friend a bunch of shit went down at Emory, a particularly violent repression of protest happened at Emory because they were interrupting class or whatever. And my buddy, you know, one of those buddies I was talking about in the last episode, is this going to be a fascist or not? Was like, guess they should have considered that it was private property. And I was like, man, do you like your boot polish with, you know, I mean, like, fuck off. Like, I don't know. It's wild.
I think your point about it being the perfect kind of protest is valid too. Like, because this isn't like a night and day shift, right? Yeah. There's been this gradual shift where when I first started becoming politically aware, the repression that I was seeing and the stuff that was beginning to radicalize me was the response against eco-terrorism, quote, eco-terrorism, that was happening in the late 90s, where people are like committing controlled arson as their form of protest. And the response to that was to get them labeled as terrorists and charge them as terrorists, which was pretty wild to me. Radical. That was one of the things that really radicalized me. Watching cops come in and fucking billy club people at the WTO protests and all that sort of shit, right? And so we see, okay, you set shit on fire, you break windows, you do the things that are happening at these protests. That's when the riot gear comes out. Yeah. Then we see with, you know, fast forward 20 years, you see at the George Floyd protests, before it's even gotten to a stage of arson or looting or anything like that that's happening, the cops are out in full riot gear, and then they're just itching for the reason, right? Someone throws a rock, it turns into a whole fucking thing. Now, you've got tents in a fucking college campus where they're watching movies.
College kids. These are college kids, okay? These are people having a communist phase. Like, I don't actually believe that. But, you know, it's like, I took Sociology 102 and now I'm a communist, Dad. Like, you know.
All your worst fears have come true.
Yeah. I've been told my whole life that I will become more conservative as I get older, which is so funny. Like,
I get more and more radical, man.
Yeah, I'm like, you know, what the fuck? But on top of that, you know, just to give it the same exact parallel, that the most obvious parallel, right? The fucking anti-war Vietnam protests. They were armed. They carried guns. Can you imagine if today's protesters were carrying guns? The kind of fucking hoopla that would be out there. It would be a massacre. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy.
I don't know. I kind of think that they should, though. I mean, and like
I think they should too.
Carissa was asking about getting a gun. I've been having that thought a lot over the last couple of years. I've fired a gun 3 times in my life. You know, went to the firing range with my dad.
Yeah, I got my riflery merit badge. You've had this conversation.
But like, you know, full disclosure, there are other reasons why I think it's probably not a good idea for us to have a gun in the house. But there is also a part of me that's like, okay, what is the end goal in my mind? And it's like, I need to know how to operate a gun.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it.
It's a crazy thought, you know, like I'm already, I know, dude, I know exactly what you mean though, because I'm already envisioning a future where I have to use a weapon. What the fuck? Like, I shouldn't even be in that state of mind.
Well, I read something somewhere, actually, maybe it was just a little tweet or something that I saw today where somebody was talking about the like reaction of young people and how did they phrase it? Shit. But they were like, I learned how to barricade a classroom before I learned how to fucking spell my name. Yes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're trained for yes. I don't have anything to expound on that, but it is a crazy point. What Carissa said that really got me was, you know, we need to get a gun before we can no longer. Again, it's just, when is that switch going to be flipped? Yeah. Right? When are we going to get a new HUAC? Like, you know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Also, I've been listening to The Devil's Chessboard, which is about Alan Dulles.
Who's that?
He was the director of the CIA for a long while. He had a very influential hand in foreign policy between World War II and maybe, I don't know when he died, but later. He's the dude that was the head of the CIA when they assassinated JFK. How fucking rich, man. I know that it's like, pointing out hypocrisy is worthless, but like how fucking rich that they're like, these Soviet show trials, okay, they're bringing in regular civilians off the street and saying they're enemies of the state and ideological enemies, and then imprisoning them or disappearing them or whatever, and then we also did that.
Yeah. I mean, it's fucking the Japanese internment camps all over.
Yes! You know, and like, I'm not justifying the Japanese internment camps, but like...
No, I didn't mean to intimate that. I'm saying like every accusation is a confession.
I know. But I mean... Well, yeah, what I'm saying is like, you know, at least with internment camps, I guess you could see their reasoning at being at war with Japan. But like, you know, again, it's like, you Soviets, your Stasi's pulling them off the streets and we did that. We did that. One thing I will say, maybe this is like more of a wrap-up thing, but I feel more confident in my understanding of opportunism now, which is odd. That when we read State and Revolution and he was ragging on Kotsky, I was like, I don't really necessarily understand what he means by opportunism here.
Yeah.
But I actually do kind of feel more confident now. Not that I would call something out as opportunism, but that I could maybe and be right.
What do you think has made the difference?
I don't know. I think it's just seeing continued examples of people shirking their ideals for short-term gain. You know, especially in the context of Karl Kautsky, a big part of the issue is that in World War I, the government called for an approval of war loans, essentially, and the Socialist Party said, sure, rather than fuck off, you know? And they were maybe the deciding vote, you know? But then again, we know how social democrats are, democratic socialists, etc.
Can I point out an area of my complete ignorance? I don't know what social chauvinism is.
Yeah.
He names it a couple of times in here.
I think that it's just like, well, it's socialists that are chauvinists. Like, I know that that's a fucking stupid thing to say, but he's talking about the fact that you can be a socialist and still have these chauvinistic ideals, you know, maybe like nationalist fervor or aggressive expansionist policy, those kind of beliefs, you know. This is too general a definition, but maybe like beliefs that are against maybe more cooperative ideas or socialist ideas. That's a great question, but the social in social chauvinists has to do with the fact that they're socialists. I'm pretty sure.
I'll look into it.
There's a similar discussion about social imperialism when it comes to countries like China. You know, is the expansion, in heavy air quotes, of China something that is imperialist in nature? You know, it's that same kind of neocolonialism debate. Like, I've heard that described as social imperialism. Same thing with in Jakarta Method when they were talking about the conflict between Vietnam and China. They were two socialist countries that had a conflict in between, you know? Yeah. For the most part, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm estimating the definition here, and then hopefully we'll find out later, and if I need to correct, I will.
Yeah.
You know?
So that was Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah. What do you think this was worth reading, Johnson?
You know, I've really been giving that some thought.
I'm on the edge as well, because this is the problem. As we become more intellectual communists, this is going to be the thing where it's like a lot of this stuff feels prerequisite, you know, like stuff I already knew, stuff I already agreed with. And I don't want that to influence the answer to this question, because a well-read communist might say no, but maybe an introductory communist would say yes. Do you know what I mean there?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be dismissive of this just because it feels like stuff that we already had knowledge of, when I do think that maybe this is a text you read early on.
I had a similar thought. I feel like I don't need to be convinced of all of this sort of stuff. So the idea that it's, quote, prerequisite, I think was kind of coloring my reading of it a little bit. And so that got me thinking, well, there are kind of two ways that you could read theory like this. And I think one is piecemeal, the way that we're doing it, and try to pick what others tell you or what we, for whatever reason, feel might be the most influential stuff to start with. Start with that and then fill in the gaps later. Or you could do it in a linear fashion. Read it in the timeline in which it was written.
Chronologically.
And the benefit of that is, you know, you don't run into this same sort of issue where it's like, well, this is prerequisite, because, I mean, it literally is prerequisite to stuff that we had read before. Yeah. So with that in mind, I don't know. I think I wouldn't start with this if I was like, what is the first piece of Lenin that I want to read? This isn't going to be it. But I am still ultimately happy that we read it.
Me too. That's what I was going to say, is that I am kind of on the edge, but ultimately I think I am erring towards, yeah, definitely. Only in such that I think it does allow you to be a little more nuanced about the discussion around imperialism, right? Like, if you're looking at imperialism with just your own maybe historical basis of knowledge, not you specifically, but you general, you might have those ideas challenged in this book, especially if you don't already have maybe a Leninist perception of imperialism. Like, I think that it might be easy to relate to Kautsky if you... What I'm thinking of is when Kautsky says that imperialism is like a policy choice. You know, that might be something that people already believe, you know, that we're choosing to do imperialism rather than the fact that it is chosen for us. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that that would be a good frame of reference to read something like this. You know, I also think that historically it holds up really well. We Americans, at the very least, haven't done jack shit to change the reality that Lenin is describing here. The domination of monopoly, the consolidation of finance capital. I mean, it's funny that he pulls out all these statistics on all these other countries, but America is so much more extreme. You know, when he's talking about the monopoly of the big banks, which is something we really didn't touch on that much, he's talking about how in Europe there's like 9 major banks, but in America there's 2. We also didn't talk about how they chop up the world. You know what I mean? Like this feels like something I could give to someone who's vaguely anti-capitalist and they would really appreciate still. You know, someone who's already like fucking Johnson & Johnson owns all of my shit. It's like this is the kind of stuff I would want them to read.
That's a good point, and I think it goes hand in hand with your point earlier about how many of the sources that he's pulling from are all bourgeois sources.
Yeah.
So it doesn't even necessarily read as a particularly radical or revolutionary text that would automatically be dismissed by someone that's not already open to those sorts of things.
Yeah. In fact, I think maybe if you, I mean, I don't know what the context is, someone would read this otherwise, but if you covered up that it's Lenin and gave it to somebody, like you could study this in an economics
Got the new Thomas
class.
Friedman book.
Yeah, it's like, this is a Capitalism and Freedom Volume 3 or whatever. But I mean, seriously, you know, not necessarily for Lenin, but something that people don't ever really think about is that Marx is like a severely influential economist, you know. What questions do you have, Johnson, now that we've read about imperialism, the highest form of capitalism? I have a couple.
Okay, go for it.
One is the one I mentioned earlier. What are the restrictions of capitalism on agriculture industry? That's a pretty specific question. But another question I have is that it's interesting to think about the evolution of these ideals. Like imperialism is a new stage of capitalism. Are we still in that same stage? How has capitalism evolved since? You know, certainly there have been tools of control introduced over the last 100 years. But are we still living in this same stage, or are we in something greater? What else is out there? Maybe that's a little more contemporary. You know, I'm not looking for Lenin 2 or anything here, but I went through that process where I was like, it's interesting to talk about imperialism in connection to colonialism because decolonization happened. And then I was like, decolonization wasn't really decolonization in the same way. These connections to colonizers still exist. They're still rampant. We still have neocolonialism, all of those things, you know, but it just made me think about, like, are we still living in the same stage today? Like, are we still living under the domination of monopolies of finance capital? I think the answer is yes at a gut level, but I don't know that for a fact.
Yeah, that's fair.
What about you? Did you have any questions for this?
I wouldn't say I was left with any questions after reading the text. The questions that I'm thinking about right now come from our conversation today, and it's mostly around that off-ramping section. Like, this feels like a very kind of elementary take, but we read There. I teach language arts for the next 3 weeks, and
congrats, by the way.
Thanks. At the beginning of the year, we read There by Tommy Orange, which is a book about being an indigenous person in the modern world. And we read it through a post-colonial lens, so we're kind of using that as a form of critical theory to do literary analysis. We're talking a lot about alienation, alterity, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so while we were doing this, there were a lot of conversations. Kids were asking questions like, well, what are we supposed to do? We stole all this land. We killed all these people.
Yeah.
We've done all of this stuff. What is the response? If we wanted to act in good faith toward the decolonization of the North American continent, what would that look like? And I didn't have a reasonable answer. I don't have a reasonable answer. It's like,
it's not for us to answer. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But
yeah. So, I mean, like, what is the appropriate response? I don't have an answer. I agree with you that it's not up to us to answer. But at the same time, here we are 200 years later, 300 years later, 400 years later.
Yeah.
So much evolution of what happens on this land has occurred in those last 4 centuries. Like, what could it possibly look like to move away from that? I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but like, what is the reasonable off-ramp in a situation like this? And I think that it's the same sort of thing. Like, if we are still operating in this stage of imperialism, how do we get out of it? Is revolution away from capitalism the only way out? That's the question I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Yes. And the thing is, I'm not trying to answer that question, but like, I think that there is an answer to that question. However, is that answer possible within the context of capitalism? Like, will capitalism ever allow that discussion to ever happen?
Oh,
No.
No.
So then in that case, revolution is the only answer, because I do think that, just to like spitball, right? I think like to think a little bit maybe more dialectically about it. Sorry, I just said that. But it's not that we're in one phase, we take the off ramp and we're going to go to the other phase, but it's more so the fact that our current environment can be changed by the introduction of something else.
That's true. Yes.
So what I'm thinking of is that if we were to earnestly as a society wake up tomorrow and acknowledge the fact that we need to do land back, then it starts with that acknowledgement, right? It starts with the introduction of that conversation. And then by the opposition of those two forces, right, the already existing environment and then that new acknowledgement of what needs to be done, something can be done. That's kind of how I feel there. But the thing is, like, I don't think that process can ever start in a scenario where it's not profitable, because we live in a context where profitability is the main driver.
Yeah, and that's where, land back was like the only thing that I had to say back to the kids.
Yeah.
And I was talking about it mostly in Canada.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think you get, the fact that the land back movement does exist is a start to land being given back, land being reclaimed by those from whom it was stolen. But then you get the kind of liberal niceties and the recuperation that's going to come along with that. Once that becomes a part of the conversation to the point where it could possibly do something, you get the like neoliberal view of, let's start this meeting today at fucking Procter & Gamble with a land acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, that's something that we do as a deflection to make ourselves feel better, even though we're doing nothing to change the material conditions for anyone. And then if it does even get enough traction to become a thing that has the potential to be revolutionary, then it's going to be recuperated and it's going to be like, well, what's the opportunity to make profit from this? How can Coca-Cola make a special can for Indigenous History Month,
I think a really jarring parallel example that that's kind of in my head now is the German response to the Holocaust. The way that living in a post-Holocaust world has affected the German psyche, so to speak, I think is probably the same kind of thing that we would see, where I'm not saying that they're doing the wrong or right thing or anything, but you've seen it rubber band all the way to the other side, where they have this like anti-Deutsch movement, which is very like pro-Zionist, and it is still harmful, but it's in the complete other direction. That's just kind of what sprung into my mind there. I don't know where I was going with that.
It's the middle ground between the minimum and maximum program.
I mean, yes. Unfortunately, I mean, it is. We're living in this environment that is an actuality, And so, like, the solution is going to come from this current reality. It's not going to come from some ideal notion of what land back looks like. And what is going to prevent it from being like, hey, welcome to our financial quarter meeting. I want to let you know that we're on Wampanoag land today. What prevents that from happening is that's the struggle. Like, that's the work that needs to be done. Because if we just leave it up to the air, that's the kind of thing we end up with.
Yeah. Sorry to take us on a tangent, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. No,
that's
I think
where my mind's been for the last half an hour.
I think that's a good one. And it's hand in hand with what I was asking. Are we still in this imperialist stage? And if so, how do we get out of it? Right? Is it revolution? Yes, it is. But
this question of, is revolution the only answer, that I ask myself a lot in situations, there's a part of me that, when I zoom out or I step back from that question, I'm like, I know that pragmatically, the reason I'm asking that question is because I truly don't believe revolution is going to happen in my lifetime. So it's like, is that the only answer? Is there something else that can be done?
Because if it is the only answer, it's not for you,
Yeah.
Not that you wouldn't choose that, but it's not going to happen for you.
Yes. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge, or I recognize, or I fear that question is coming from a space of me not even being committed to the idea of revolution as a possibility. And so it's like, am I just asking this question because I want
to get out of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like,
are you sure revolution's the only option? Because I really don't want to do revolution, please.
Not to always talk about propaganda, but Adventures in Zoocosis, man. It's like, I'd rather sit in my fucking comfortable cage because I've lived my entire life getting used to that. I have now succumbed to the operant conditioners.
Yeah. I'm comfortable with this negative piece.
Exactly. And it's like, that makes me not feel great. And I wonder, I have to be skeptical about where that question is coming from when I ask it.
I wholeheartedly agree with you there. And I think that, maybe I just need to like do away with it. Maybe I just need to say, yeah, revolution is the answer, and that's it. There's no question about it. Because in my communist heart of hearts, I know that is the truth.
Yes.
You know, in my practical heart of hearts, I am with you, and I'm on the same page as you.
Intellectually, I understand that is the answer. The other thing that makes me very uncomfortable with it is that I feel like it's very nebulous. And what does revolution look like?
Yeah.
Obviously, it's going to meet the time that it arrives, you know what I mean? And it will be a long process. It's not a day.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just going to happen. It's going to be an ongoing thing. And so because so much of that is unknown is part of where I'm like, is that the answer? What does that answer look like? That's part of where that discomfort comes from.
Yeah.
And it's like, am I ready to participate in protracted people's war? Is that what the revolution is going to look like? You know what I mean? Is it purely a cultural revolution? I mean, I don't know shit about Mao. So
yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. The nebulousness of revolution is something that worries me a lot, obviously. And I think that the solution is what we're doing right now. You know, we are engaging in a radical self-education. We're filling the gaps, right? I mean, it's not that we're quelling that discomfort, but we are widening the scope to the point where maybe we can get a bigger picture. Maybe we can see the edges a little bit better.
It may not be defined, but at least we know where it ends.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
That's a weird way to say that.
I know exactly what you mean, though. It's like we're not necessarily concerned with the trees. We're more concerned with the forest.
Yeah. I was imagining some sort of metaphor where we can hold on to it even if we can't see it exactly. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This is totally off kilter. Nintendo announced the Switch 2. Yep. Well, the reason I say this is because
I did not see that coming at all.
I know. That's why I was like, wait a minute. But here's the thing. I read that they allowed accessory manufacturers, they wouldn't let them see it, but they would let them put their hands in a box and feel the shape so they could design accessories along those shapes. And that's kind of what it is. That's kind of, I know, dude, what the
Revolution
fuck?
is the Switch 2.
It's so shitty, but we're literally like hands without eyes. We're feeling it out as we're going. It's impossible for us to understand the whole scope of what this is. We can only feel around it enough to kind of understand the form. And hopefully that understanding of the form is enough for us to at least approximate the ideal. I know that idea of approximating the ideal is uncomfortable because we want to be principled, true communists, whatever. But like at the end of the day, there's no perfect revolution. You know, even if revolution does happen, I don't think it's going to be some like arms across America, hand in hand, go away, evil capitalists. It's not going to be anything like that. You know, it will be dirty, messy, disgusting, awful, horrid, one way or the other. And ultimately, I think that comes from the fact that it's violent. Like, it's something that's uncomfortable to us, especially living in the context of a non-violent society, you know, like a society without actual realized violence on the day-to-day.
Yeah, without active violence occurring daily,
Yeah, it's really tough.
What are we reading next?
Next, we are going to read Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels.
Yes. Back to Engels.
Why did we choose this?
Why did we choose it?
Because it's short.
I think because it's short, we wanted to read more Engels.
Yeah. Short, sweet, theoretical. Read a little more Engels.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. How did we do, right? What else should we read? Do you agree? What the fuck? Don't forget, you can always leave us feedback at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Shoot us a message, okay? We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email. Let us know what else is there to read. Is there anything we missed? That's always a big one.
Yeah, I'm also really interested because we jumped into this without having a concrete game plan and just figured we'd find our way as we went. And I think a few things have shifted in our kind of format as we've gone along, the way that we've done it. And I'm curious on the feedback about that. Are there things that we still need to be pivoting on? Should we be doing episodes that are ideologically based rather than purely text-based, where we explore an idea and maybe look at multiple thinkers' interpretations? That, like, ideas like that, I'm really interested to hear what those of you in the audience have to say.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Let us know. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Well, with that,
let us know how we close an episode at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Fucking Christ. All right, take it easy, y'all.
Bye.